He was humiliated in front of an entire boardroom because of a coffee stain on his shirt, a stain that, to them, confirmed everything they already assumed about a black man in a tailored suit sitting at their table. They laughed, whispered, and smirked, mistaking his silence for shame and his calm for weakness. What they didn't know was that the man they dismissed, the one they excluded from meetings, reassigned without warning, and treated like he didn't belong, was the one person in that building holding the power to change everything they thought was theirs. But not yet. Not here. For now he stayed quiet, watched, waited, and while they built walls to keep him on the outside, he was laying foundations beneath their feet. This isn't just a story about corporate arrogance. It's about how racism hides behind professionalism, and how dignity doesn't mean staying silent forever. Stick around, because when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't just expose them. It rewrites the rules. If you've ever been judged by your skin before your skill, this one's for you. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you're ready to see justice done right, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when everything flips. The morning had barely begun, but the corporate floor already buzzed with polished shoes and louder egos. Desmond Hale stepped into the lobby of Stratford and Roe's downtown tower, wearing his best navy suit, freshly pressed and tailored to sharp, clean lines. His shoes shined, his briefcase organized, his hair cut and close. He had prepped the entire night before, rechecking figures, forecasts, and strategy slides for the quarterly acquisition report that bore his name on the cover. The presentation was at 8. He arrived at 7:20, early but not too early, calm but alert. This was not his first high-stakes meeting, but it was the first one where he would be presenting solo to the firm's top brass, including Chase Reamer, the vice president of corporate development, known more for his arrogance than his intellect. Desmond nodded at the receptionist as he checked in. She paused for a second longer than necessary before handing him a visitor badge, hesitated, then gestured vaguely toward a set of elevators. Second floor, down the left, she mumbled, then turned her attention to the next person in line, a junior associate in a slate-gray dress who greeted her by name. Desmond didn't flinch. He made his way to the elevator, tapped the button, and waited. The light above the door blinked. He adjusted the strap of his case, glanced around. People came and went, all fast, all polished. Several eyed him briefly and passed. As the elevator opened and he stepped in, a young assistant, clipboard in hand, ponytail tight, called out, "Hold up, maintenance is that way, sir." Desmond turned. She looked up properly this time, froze a second too long, and then offered a tight smile. "Sorry, I assumed." He gave a short nod and stepped inside, saying nothing. The elevator ride was quiet. Floor 2 chimed. As the doors opened, a gust of cool, conditioned air greeted him. Desmond walked down the corridor toward the glass-walled conference room. Through the window, he could see the early arrivals, suits gathered in casual circles, sipping espresso, checking their watches, or laughing about last night's game. Desmond entered. The laughter stopped for a moment, then resumed. At the far end, Chase Reamer stood flanked by 2 directors, gesturing with a cup in one hand and his phone in the other. Desmond walked to the refreshment counter, poured a modest amount of coffee into a paper cup, and turned, just as someone bumped him. A sharp elbow, an unintended step. The liquid jumped, splashed against his shirt just above the belt line, dark and immediate. The room froze for half a second. Then someone let out a chuckle. Then 2 more. Then the room laughed. Not cruelly, but not kindly either. A ripple of amusement at a man who now looked out of place. Chase didn't laugh out loud. He just smirked, a slow, satisfied tilt of the head that said more than words. Desmond nodded once, found a napkin, blotted the stain in silence, then walked to his assigned seat. Not the second chair to Chase's left, as originally indicated. His nameplate had been moved, replaced by Kyle Zimmerman's. Desmond's was now on the end near the wall, just barely within sightline of the main display. No one offered an explanation. No one needed to. He sat, quiet. The presentation began shortly after. Kyle took lead. The opening slide bore Desmond's formatting, but Kyle spoke like he wrote it. Desmond watched, still. At minute 24, the numbers began to wobble. Kyle faltered. A question from the board. Then another. Then silence. Kyle turned. All eyes shifted. Desmond clicked once, slid his laptop forward, and clarified the gap in under 30 seconds. No drama, just precision. The board nodded. The room moved on. Chase looked at him once. Just once. Then looked away. When the meeting ended, no one said anything to Desmond. No well done. No thanks. Just passing comments to Kyle. Just chuckles about the stain. Desmond left the room as quietly as he entered. Back through the lobby. Past the receptionist, who didn't look up. His inbox pinged with new messages, meeting invites, and revision threads. But what caught his eye was the absence of something. There was no summary follow-up from the strategy meeting he had worked on for weeks, no data request, no looped thread asking for clarification or detail on the models he had provided. Curious, he scrolled through the system drive, pulled up the shared presentation folder, and opened the uploaded file labeled Q3 Consolidation Plan Final. His breath stilled for a moment as the first slide loaded. The title was familiar. The cover layout unmistakably his own structure. But the content beneath, the actual strategic approach and supporting data, had been gutted and rewritten into something generic, weaker, vague. Worse, it had been attributed to Kyle Zimmerman. The metadata confirmed the file had been submitted just 4 hours before the meeting. None of Desmond's case logic remained. None of the predicted synergies, none of the forecast models. The team had effectively erased him and quietly repackaged his work into a hollow version fronted by someone else. He sat still, the cursor blinking in silence, then closed the file and returned to his inbox. A new message appeared just then, an automatic reminder about the firm's annual innovation forum. He had proposed a workshop months ago titled Decentralized Pathways to M&A Integration, and it had been accepted in principle with strong internal interest. The calendar invite, however, listed the event and every confirmed speaker, but his name was missing. He checked the planning thread, found himself absent from the chain, and realized the workshop had been reassigned to a manager from the Boston office. No explanation, no forward, just deleted from relevance as neatly as a spreadsheet column. A second email arrived shortly after from a junior assistant named Brooke, apologizing for the mix-up in scheduling and suggesting that Desmond could still attend the panel as an observer if he'd like. The message ended with a smiley face and a thank you for your understanding. He stared at the screen, the muscles in his neck rigid. His understanding, that was the phrase. Not his value, not his leadership, not his vision, his understanding. Desmond closed the email slowly, exhaled once through his nose, and leaned back in his chair. From behind him, the ambient chatter of the team's open floor buzzed lightly. Small talk, Slack pings, someone laughing about dinner reservations. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged what had happened. Kyle passed behind him at one point, offered a glance that carried no recognition, and continued toward the break room, where he loudly joked about post-meeting martinis with Chase. Desmond didn't move. He opened a fresh document and began typing, not notes, not ideas, but a list of names. Not a hit list, he thought grimly, but close enough. At the top was Chase Reamer. Below that, Kyle Zimmerman. Then others. He wasn't angry. He was done being surprised. Desmond had lived long enough to know the shape of exclusion when it happened. It wasn't usually overt. It didn't arrive with a slap or a door slammed shut. It came with omissions, with changed invites, with silent edits, with names removed from footers and praise rerouted to safer, whiter hands. That afternoon, he walked into the team floor meeting, where project leads were supposed to share weekly updates. The table was full. There were no chairs left, though he had been CC'd on the invite. Chase walked in 10 minutes late, clapping Kyle on the back and ignoring Desmond completely. The presentation opened with a mention of momentum and market timing, both concepts that Desmond had raised in prior drafts, but were now being used without attribution. When it came time for input, Desmond raised a point about risk modeling, careful but clear. Chase glanced at him briefly, then waved the comment off, pivoting to Kyle for reinforcement. Kyle repeated the same idea, rephrased, with less depth. Chase nodded. Good instinct, Kyle. Exactly where our thinking needs to go. Desmond nodded once to himself. This wasn't just bias. It was orchestration. A quiet, deliberate reduction of presence. And it was working. By the end of the day, he had received an updated org chart showing a temporary shift in reporting lines. His name now fell under an interim supervisor, a man he had once mentored, without discussion or context. At 5:30, Desmond packed his things and stepped out into the parking lot. The autumn wind was sharp against his face. He didn't drive home. He sat in his car and opened a folder from his briefcase. Inside was a sealed envelope signed weeks ago. It contained final stage documentation, a corporate acquisition offer, confidential, not yet public, but binding. He flipped it over, then back again, as if weighing not the paper but the power. The firm that had just erased him was unknowingly days away from becoming his. They had written him off as decoration, as temporary, as expendable. He folded the printout neatly and tucked it away without comment. At this point, he had learned to read silence better than words. His real meeting, however, would be in the elevator 10 minutes later, though he didn't know it yet. As the lift doors slid open on the executive level, Desmond stepped inside, briefcase in hand, posture firm. He had reviewed his notes twice and rehearsed his updates mentally. But just as the elevator began its ascent, the door opened again. And there stood Gregory Vaughn, the Executive Vice President of Operations, the man who once gave a TED Talk about leadership through empathy. Vaughn entered without looking at Desmond, adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket, and finally turned, eyes landing squarely on him. There was a pause, brief but stinging. Then Vaughn gestured to the stainless steel panels and asked flatly, "Has maintenance finished the glass detailing in here yet?" His voice was clipped, his tone practiced, but the implication settled like dust in Desmond's lungs. For a half second, no one spoke. Then Desmond answered calmly, "Clearly, elevator looks great, sir." Vaughn didn't flinch, didn't apologize. He simply nodded, turned to face the front again, and watched the numbers light up. Floor 24, floor 25, floor 26. The doors opened. Vaughn stepped out without a glance back. Desmond stood still. The only sound was the gentle hum of the lift and the echo of something heavier settling in his chest. Later that afternoon, he attended the firm's annual Client Innovation Gala, a lavish event held at a downtown hotel where prospective partners and high-net-worth clients mingled over hors d'oeuvres and champagne. Desmond had been a key liaison on one of the largest client onboarding projects that year and expected to be recognized accordingly. He arrived early, dressed in a midnight gray suit, name badge clipped to his breast pocket, portfolio notes prepared and rehearsed. But as he approached the registration table, the attendant behind the desk offered him a green guest packet, the color designated for event staff and vendor representatives. Desmond raised a brow and gently clarified his name, his division, and his role. The attendant blinked, glanced down at the list, then apologized with a sheepish smile. "Sorry," she said. "You just look like someone on the logistics crew." She handed him the correct folder this time, blue for corporate, but the damage was already done. A small group nearby had witnessed the exchange. One man whispered something under his breath, and a woman let out a stifled chuckle. Desmond nodded, offered no reaction, and stepped into the ballroom with the quiet grace of a man who knew better than to demand acknowledgement. Throughout the night, the pattern continued. A catering supervisor asked him if he could help load equipment. A guest mistook him for valet and offered a parking stub. One client leaned over during the keynote presentation and whispered, "Can you get us 2 more of those little lamb bites?" Desmond kept a mental tally, not of the offenses themselves, but of the people who committed them without hesitation or second thought. He wasn't dressed differently. He wasn't behaving out of sync. He was simply invisible until mistaken for help. And then, suddenly, hypervisible, but only through the lens of assumed subservience. What made it worse was that no one corrected it. Not once. Kyle passed by with a glass of wine, saw the exchange with the valet ticket, smirked, and moved on without intervening. Chase gave a brief speech on diversity and resilience, but failed to acknowledge Desmond's department at all. Near the end of the evening, Desmond stepped outside onto the rooftop terrace, away from the soft jazz and curated networking. The skyline stretched beyond him, glittering with empty offices and brighter towers. He leaned against the stone rail, took one steady breath, and told himself to remember, not just the laughter or the badge or the elevator, but the silence, the validation that never came, the way people who knew better said nothing, the way power disguised itself behind charm, behind charity, behind the soft glow of a gala spotlight. Later, when the event was winding down, Desmond returned to the lobby to find his ride had been redirected without notification. A junior partner who had requested a corporate car had been prioritized, and Desmond's own transport was rerouted to a late client request. A concierge apologized. Miscommunication, she explained, while avoiding eye contact. Desmond nodded. "Thank you," he replied. Then he stepped outside, loosened his tie, and hailed his own cab under the indifferent flicker of the hotel's overhang lights. When he stepped onto the project floor that morning, a quiet hum of activity greeted him, but the usual sense of rhythm was off. People looked up when he passed. They didn't smile. They didn't greet. Some glanced down at their screens. Others turned their chairs slightly as if making room for someone passing too close. Desmond logged into the system and found the first surprise in his inbox. A reassignment, effective immediately. No subject line, no body text, just a forwarded attachment titled Project Echo Transfer Memo. His name was no longer associated with the high-value merger he had prepared for months, the one he had initiated, researched, and designed from the ground up. Instead, the lead role had been reassigned to someone who had once reported directly to him, Tyler Cormick, a recent MBA graduate who had joined the firm just 18 months prior. Desmond's new assignment was something called Project Bridal, a stalled divestment review focused on a failing supplier chain in the Midwest. It had been shelved for lack of budget, deemed non-priority, a placeholder initiative kept alive for optics rather than strategy. Desmond checked the logs. No recent updates. No resource allocations. No analyst support. The project wasn't just low profile. It was lifeless, and they had handed it to him like a used rag. Still, Desmond said nothing. He clicked the documents open, read the stale notes, flagged items for review. He copied Tyler's name into a fresh note and began cataloging what he knew. His style, his shortcuts, his alliances. The game had shifted. He would shift with it. That Friday, the division held its quarterly performance review in the auditorium, where senior management presented results, awarded praise, and set goals. Desmond took his seat near the back, knowing full well what was coming. Chase stepped up to the microphone, his tone polished, his blazer crisp. He spoke about momentum, about cultural fit, about nurturing potential. When he finally acknowledged the strategic development team, he commended Kyle for adaptability, praised Tyler for leadership under pressure, and even noted Brooks' growing instincts in stakeholder relations. Desmond's name never surfaced. Not for results, not for contribution, not for anything. This despite the fact that he alone had delivered 3 consecutive quarters of target exceedance. He had saved a client deal through quiet back-channeling. He had rebuilt a failing model after a junior's miscalculation threatened a budget breach. He had done it without complaint, without overtime billing, and without letting mistakes rise to the surface. And yet, when the slide deck displayed performance metrics, his color-coded ranking had been muted to gray neutral. Not bad, not good, just unseen. After the presentation, people mingled. Desmond walked to the back hallway, away from the noise, and stood before the window that overlooked the plaza. A voice called his name. It was Brooke, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one. He declined. She shifted awkwardly, then said that she had heard Tyler was now leading the consolidation project. She paused, then added softly, "You deserve that spot. Everyone knows." Desmond met her gaze. He said nothing. She looked away. He appreciated her sentiment, but sentiment wasn't leverage. And he had learned not to lean on sympathy. Not here. By Monday, new rumors had begun to circulate. That Desmond was disengaged, that he was difficult to collaborate with, that he preferred to work alone. These weren't direct accusations, just whispers, hints. Enough to create hesitation in the minds of those who didn't know better. Enough to seed doubt without ever making a claim. In one department update, a middle manager referenced Desmond as an example of technical excellence lacking leadership initiative. The quote stung, not because it was true, it wasn't, but because it had been rehearsed. Someone had planted that language with purpose. He began to receive calendar invites for developmental feedback sessions, low-stakes one-on-ones masked as career growth initiatives. One manager mentioned that Desmond's communication style could benefit from a bit more warmth. Another suggested he show more team-building spirit, perhaps organize social lunches or off-site mixers. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He nodded, made notes, and left. But each meeting was another weight layered atop his credibility, a quiet campaign to erode his standing from within. Desmond understood this wasn't a mistake. It was a method. He responded not with confrontation, but with precision. He documented every exchange, saved every reassignment notice, archived internal files. He backed up correspondence that revealed origin dates of his models and proposals. He built a folder on his home drive and labeled it simply, Ledger. Not out of paranoia, but preparation. When systems fail, only records survive. And he intended to survive. By the time autumn folded fully into the city, bringing with it sharp winds and earlier sunsets, Desmond had already grown used to the temperature drop, not outside, but inside the company walls. The chill was institutional now, laced into every memo, every invitation not sent, every nod that never came. He arrived early, as always, walked past reception where the smiles had grown thinner, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and sat in silence reviewing a weekly operations report when the first sign of escalation arrived. The message came from finance. A flagged error in a Q2 reconciliation report that had been submitted for audit. It was a data misalignment, 6 figures off, significant enough to warrant attention, but not disastrous. Still, the tone of the email was sharp. The trail, they claimed, pointed back to Desmond. He had reviewed the numbers 3 weeks prior, they said, and, as such, was the last point of responsibility before the file was finalized. The message was CC'd to 2 senior directors, 1 legal advisor, and Chase. There was no question mark in the language, no request for comment. It was a subtle but effective maneuver, an accusation disguised as procedure. Desmond reread the message 3 times, then opened his archive. Within 2 minutes, he located the thread from that week, confirmed the data had been altered after his review, and identified the exact timestamp when Kyle's assistant had made the final edit, presumably under instruction. He compiled a short report, attached evidence, and replied with calm, factual language. No defensiveness. No emotion, just truth. The response was clinical, but he knew the damage wasn't in the facts. It was in the implication. And that part could not be undone by logic. Later that day, a department meeting was held to address audit exposure. Desmond attended quietly, choosing a seat by the wall, noting how others shifted in their chairs when he entered. The director opened with broad comments about accuracy, vigilance, and trust. He never used names, but his glances made intentions obvious. When the slide titled Recent Oversights appeared, it included a red asterisk over a report Desmond had once led. Context was omitted. Attribution was vague. Desmond said nothing. When the meeting ended, people exited in clusters. One colleague brushed past and muttered without making eye contact, "Rough break." Another avoided him entirely. He returned to his desk and sat down slowly, reviewing his calendar. A meeting request appeared. Confidential, performance follow-up, sent by HR. No details. That evening, as Desmond walked to the parking structure, the building lights flickered on behind him. He passed a cluster of employees at the corner cafe, heard the hush in their voices when he neared. He kept walking. Back in his apartment, he opened his encrypted folder and added 2 new documents. One was a screen grab of the altered spreadsheet metadata. The other was a saved copy of a message he had seen earlier that day, forwarded anonymously. It was internal, not meant for public eyes. The subject line, long-term cultural fit. The body was short but revealing. A summary from a closed executive strategy session, where leadership discussed retention models and organizational identity. The line that mattered was near the bottom. One profile in particular raises concerns around optics and alignment. Background may not reflect the core aesthetic or leadership image we promote. Desmond Hale was the only individual referenced by name. It was not open hostility. It was cold, calculated exclusion spoken in sanitized vocabulary. Not qualified, not visible, not the image. Aesthetic, alignment, words chosen not to confront, but to conceal. The next morning, HR greeted him with polished faces and tight smiles. They reviewed the spreadsheet error again, asked routine questions, repeated that this was not punitive, just procedural. Desmond answered calmly. He presented his version of the events, submitted documents, offered timestamps. The room nodded, took notes, promised follow-up. But he recognized the shift in their posture. The way one rep, a woman named Lynn, stopped making eye contact after the second question. The way the other repeatedly emphasized team cohesion, contribution to culture, organizational values. Phrases that had nothing to do with numbers. Phrases meant to speak to character without directly saying character. Back on the floor, things had changed. Desmond's access to shared folders was suddenly restricted. His view-only privileges were reinstated. A junior colleague, once deferential, now took over status calls without consulting him. When Desmond raised the concern to his manager, the response was vague. "We're just trying to give everyone opportunities to grow. We value your input, of course. But it's important not to dominate every space." It wasn't just erasure now. It was inversion. Success framed as obstruction. Competence spun as intimidation. Each day, Desmond arrived earlier, left later, ate alone, walked alone. The same man who had once been the firm's quiet anchor had become its silent target. The worst came not from the mistake or the exclusion. It came from the knowledge that none of it was random. It was engineered, managed through small decisions by people who called it neutral, who spoke of balance and diversity while quietly ensuring that anyone outside the mold would eventually fall away. Desmond knew what this was. He'd seen it before. He just hadn't expected it to come wrapped in expensive suits and polite smiles, with HR forms instead of slurs, with language about alignment instead of rejection. But the result was the same. Invisible bars, silent verdicts, exile without the drama of conflict. Desmond had used that lounge for 3 years without issue, a quiet space reserved for senior staff and client hosting, marked only by a discreet plaque beside the sliding glass doors. That morning, he entered with the same badge he'd always used. The reader blinked red. He swiped again. Another denial. Behind him, a junior employee passed, flashed his own badge, and entered without pause. A security guard noticed the delay, approached, asked for Desmond's name. When Desmond identified himself, the guard hesitated, tapped his earpiece, and then delivered the line with practiced smoothness. "I'm sorry, sir, but your access level doesn't include this space anymore. Perhaps try the employee cafe on 12. Desmond held his gaze. The guard remained polite, but the implication was unmistakable. He was no longer considered part of the circle. Not in title, not in privileges, not in trust. Desmond didn't argue. He turned, walked toward the elevators, pressed 12. In the break room, the lights were harsher, the tables more crowded, the conversations louder. He sat near the window, opened his laptop, and responded to 3 emails without looking up. One came from investor relations, reminding him of the closed-door internal shareholder session scheduled for Friday. He had prepared material for the event weeks ago, submitted it to Chase's office on time, even received confirmation that he would be speaking on projected vertical integrations. The panel topic had been his idea, pitched months ago, approved via email. But 2 hours after the security incident, a revised agenda was circulated. Desmond's name was missing. He checked the original approval. It was still there. He forwarded the confirmation to Brooke, who had helped him schedule it. She replied a few minutes later with an apologetic note, saying there must have been a clerical error and that she would check with the coordinator. The coordinator never responded. By Thursday, the final program had gone to print. Desmond was not on it. On Friday morning, he arrived at the shareholder session early, dressed with intention. His seat card had been moved to the far end of the conference table, near catering. When he asked about it, the event manager offered a vague response about reshuffled priorities. As the event began, he watched others take the stage, some delivering slides based on his research, others referencing initiatives he had quietly authored without citation. Desmond remained still, taking notes not on the content, but on the omissions. When the Q&A portion opened, he stood, raised his hand, waited. The moderator scanned the room and nodded to someone else. Desmond waited again, lifted his hand slightly higher. The moderator looked at him, then quickly checked her notes. "We'll need to stick to pre-selected participants due to time," she said, already turning toward the next question. Desmond sat back down. Not angry, just resolute. That afternoon, in the privacy of his office, he reviewed the timeline. Access revoked. Panel canceled. Voice silenced. His body might have still occupied the building, but his presence had been excised. And yet his influence lingered in every corner. Frameworks he built, contacts he cultivated, deals he assembled. They wanted him gone but not forgotten, erased but still useful, silent but still compliant. He would not grant them that satisfaction. The acquisition contract sat in his desk drawer, untouched for weeks. But now it felt heavier than ever, as if waiting for a signal. His name wasn't on the cover. He had arranged it that way on purpose. The firm acquiring Stratford & Rowe was a quiet entity with no flash, no press, and no need for premature visibility. But Desmond had ensured that when the ink dried, he would be the one signing on the final line. Before leaving the office that evening, he returned to the executive lounge. The security guard was different this time, younger, unsure. Desmond nodded, didn't try to swipe in. He wasn't there to test his access. He simply wanted to see it again one last time before everything changed. Inside, through the glass, he could see Tyler chatting with a client, Carl smiling beside him, and Chase standing with his back to the window, gesturing grandly. They didn't see Desmond. They hadn't seen him in weeks. But soon they would. Desmond entered the room in silence, taking the seat at the far end, the same one they had relegated him to during past meetings, this time of his own choosing. He wore a charcoal suit, subtle pinstripes, a black tie. He had not been invited to speak. His name was not listed on the morning's agenda. But he was the only one in the room who knew that nothing about today would unfold as expected. He sat still while the others filtered in. Chase first, confident and careless, Cal behind him, carrying a laptop he barely understood, and then Vaughn, who offered Desmond a nod too slow to be sincere. A junior associate dimmed the lights as the presentation began. The screen showed the company's logo, the agenda laid out in bullet points, and at the bottom, a placeholder reading Strategic Update Final Merger Protocol. Chase cleared his throat, stood, and began a speech he had practiced for days. He spoke of legacy, of adaptability, of vision. He thanked the transition committee and praised the synergy between departments. The tone was optimistic, ceremonial, perfectly rehearsed. No one interrupted him. Not yet. Desmond waited, his hands folded calmly in his lap, the small folder before him unopened. When the digital clock above the door hit 10 a.m., a paralegal entered and handed out copies of the final integration agreement, 79 pages in total, dense with legal terms and redline provisions. Chase motioned for approval to begin. A vote would follow. Signatures would be collected. A press release was scheduled for 2 p.m. Desmond did not reach for a pen. Instead, he reached for his folder. The gesture was quiet, deliberate. The moment his fingers touched the brass clasp, Chase noticed. He paused mid-sentence. Desmond opened the folder and removed a single document, thicker stock, no company branding. bearing only a letterhead from a private holding entity based in Delaware. He placed it on the table and spoke clearly, but without raising his voice. "I believe there's one amendment that hasn't been accounted for." The room froze. Chase blinked, trying to compute the interruption. Vaughn turned his head slowly, brows furrowed. Desmond slid the document forward. As it passed from hand to hand, expressions shifted: confusion, disbelief, and finally recognition. The paperwork wasn't a suggestion. It was confirmation. The holding company acquiring Stratford and Rowe was not a faceless investment group, as they had assumed. It was an entity controlled by Desmond Hale. Through a series of blind trusts, staggered acquisitions, and carefully timed equity purchases, Desmond had acquired a controlling stake in the firm that now owned 78% of Stratford and Rowe's outstanding shares. In short, Desmond was the buyer, not just a shareholder, not a consultant, not a staff member. He was the man who now held more power in this room than all of them combined. A silence spread across the table like ink and water. Someone shifted in their chair. The junior associate froze halfway through pouring a glass. Chase laughed once, hollow and sharp, then stopped when no one joined him. Vaughn asked the question everyone was thinking. "Is this real?" Desmond nodded once. A board member confirmed it. She had received documentation from the transition committee 2 days earlier. The name had been redacted, but the percentages matched. Desmond met her gaze. The redaction had not been an oversight. It had been part of the plan. Chase tried to recover, to reassert himself. He asked why Desmond hadn't disclosed his interest. Desmond responded calmly that full disclosure was unnecessary during preliminary stages, and that per the structure of the holding agreement, all legal thresholds had been satisfied. He leaned forward just slightly. "I was transparent where the law required it, just not where your expectations assumed it." At that moment, the room truly understood what had happened. The man they had laughed at, isolated, and sidelined had outmaneuvered them not through confrontation, but through preparation. He had used every insult, every oversight, every denial as cover. While they excluded him from rooms, he built new ones. While they questioned his worth, he consolidated control. While they erased his contributions, he rewrote their future without them knowing. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. Quiet, legal, total. Desmond, meanwhile, didn't rush. He remained seated in that same chair at the far end of the table, reviewing his notes with the calm of someone who had already accepted the outcome. He allowed the silence to stretch because he understood that silence, this kind, was transformative. The absence of rebuttal was an acknowledgement of truth. By noon, the first wave of formal acknowledgments had begun. A company-wide email was issued, short and sterile, announcing that effective immediately, ownership and governance would be jointly transitioned to the Hale Investment Trust, pending full operational realignment. No names were included, no explanations. But the recipients understood, and the ones who had been closest to the rot began to feel their footing shift. Desmond didn't enact punishment. He didn't walk the floor with declarations or fire anyone in dramatic fashion. What he did was quieter, more exacting. He called for a meeting with the human capital leadership team and directed them to begin a full audit of departmental decision-making, hiring trends, promotion logs, and complaint resolutions over the last 5 years. He requested anonymized datasets. He asked for crosstabs on disciplinary records against demographic trends. He flagged repeat language patterns across internal memos, words like fit, polish, cultural tone, executive image. When one director asked for clarification, Desmond simply said, "Let's be honest about what we've built. Let's be honest about what we've protected." Then came the emails. One by one, across the floor, inboxes lit up. Staff members who had played roles, active or passive, in his marginalization received formal reassignments. Not firings, not public shaming, just a clean reshuffle. Kyle Zimmerman was moved to an external communications rotation in a satellite office. Tyler Cormick was reassigned to a market research post with limited decision-making scope. Even Chase, who had stood unchallenged for years, was invited, not ordered, to take a voluntary sabbatical while the restructuring took place. The company did not collapse. It exhaled. The realignment was orderly. No one made a scene. No one sent out angry messages. They understood what this was. Not vengeance, but consequence. And then, in what many considered the most surprising move of all, Desmond scheduled a town hall. The subject line read, "Equity in practice. Mandatory attendance. No substitutes. No laptops." The auditorium was full. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt, a few out of fear. Desmond walked onto the stage without escort, without fanfare. He spoke not as a victor, but as someone tired of a lie that professionalism had ever been neutral. He shared no anecdotes. He didn't mention the stain on his shirt, the panel he was barred from, or the countless doors that had shut in his face. He simply laid out a plan, an initiative to rewrite the company's cultural code from the inside out. A committee would be formed not of HR veterans, not of legacy executives, but of individuals nominated anonymously by their peers across levels, across departments. Its purpose would be to audit not just processes, but power, the invisible kind, the kind that determines who speaks and who waits, who is believed and who is questioned, who belongs and who is corrected. Those who had laughed at Desmond weeks ago now sat with their heads lowered, not because he was delivering punishment, but because he was offering something more difficult, a mirror. Then he did something unexpected. He invited them in, not to redeem themselves, not to seek forgiveness, but to participate, to be part of the correction. He named Kyle. He named Tyler. He even referenced Chase. He asked them to step forward and help construct a framework that no longer relied on familiarity to define merit. Some of them hesitated. Some agreed. But all of them understood that something had ended, and something else had begun. In the days that followed, Desmond moved without spectacle. He refused interviews. He declined public praise. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted results. Behind the scenes, he restructured the promotion pipeline to include blind evaluation rounds. He placed independent ombuds officers in each department with direct lines to his office. He rewrote onboarding protocols to teach not just policy, but awareness. He met with interns, with mailroom staff, with legal aides. When one of them asked why, he answered plainly, "Because what happened to me should never have been possible. And because I'm not the only one it happened to." The executive lounge doors now opened at his badge swipe, but Desmond rarely used them. He preferred the 12th floor cafe, where the lines were longer, the noise louder, but the distance between people much smaller. It wasn't humility, it was intentionality. He wanted them to see him not above, but among. Richard Calhoun, the regional managing director of the Northeast Division, had long been seen as untouchable. He was a legacy name, connected to early shareholders, a fixture in leadership known more for backdoor influence than forward thinking. He had not been present at the town hall, citing travel conflicts, though the truth was simpler. He had refused. He considered the entire initiative a distraction. Privately, he told peers the company was bending too far, diluting its core image, and drifting into performative politics. Unfortunately for Richard, what he believed to be private had not remained so. Less than 6 hours after Desmond's internal announcement of the equity overhaul, a series of leaked internal messages began to circulate, not through the press, but through anonymous Dropbox and encrypted threads viewed by investors, oversight board members, and key legal observers. The content was damning. Conversations between Richard and a small circle of senior managers detailed deliberate gatekeeping around promotion tracks, where candidates were filtered not by performance metrics, but by coded language like polish, presence, and alignment with brand DNA. In one message, Richard wrote, "I don't care what his numbers are, he doesn't present well for client-facing roles. He's not our type." Another chain referenced Desmond directly. It read, "Hale's technically brilliant, but we can't let that become the new normal. He's an exception, not a precedent." That line became a spark. It spread not as gossip, but as evidence. Cold, typed, dated. It revealed the system, not just a man. And the response was immediate. The board didn't hold a public vote. There was no formal announcement. Richard arrived at his office that afternoon and found his access badge deactivated. A private call from legal informed him that a vote of no confidence had passed. The controlling shareholder, Hale Trust, had moved. There would be no severance, only a transition review. Richard didn't fight. He didn't call. He packed quietly and left through the service entrance without fanfare. No one followed. No one said goodbye. The man who once walked the halls like a king had been removed not with scandal, but with silence. But the fallout extended beyond one figurehead. The leaked messages triggered a full audit of executive communication over the previous 36 months. A team of outside consultants, appointed independently by Desmond, were brought in to review thousands of emails, internal threads, and chat logs. The findings uncovered a systemic culture of exclusion masked as tradition. Desmond did not reveal the names publicly. He did not issue statements. But those involved were invited to individual meetings, where they were presented with excerpts from their own correspondence and asked one question: "Do you believe this reflects who we are meant to be?" Some resigned immediately. Others requested to be reassigned or placed on review. A few denied everything, then vanished without a trace. But the most unexpected development came from the ground floor. Employees who had long remained quiet, analysts, receptionists, interns, began submitting testimonials. Not complaints, stories. About the comments brushed aside, the ideas stolen, the laughter that always stopped when certain people entered the room. They weren't angry. They were ready. The company's culture file grew by the day, not as a list of transgressions, but as a blueprint for reform. Desmond read every submission. In one of the most symbolic moments, the internal recognition program, a glossy hallway wall of employee portraits titled Legacy Contributors, was quietly dismantled. Not destroyed, replaced. A new series of panels went up, this time titled Architects of Change. And unlike the old display, these faces came from every floor, every department, every background. Desmond didn't pose for a photo. His face wasn't on the wall. But those who passed it knew who made it possible. One late evening, Desmond sat alone in his office, the city lights humming beyond the glass. A printed report lay on his desk, thick with audit results, redacted lines, footnotes of compliance. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out the envelope from the first day of the acquisition, the same one that held the contract, the vision, the structure. He opened it and slid it into a shredder. It was no longer necessary. The change had already taken hold. The city had begun to thaw by the time the final chapter quietly unfolded, not with declarations or headlines, but with a shift in posture, in atmosphere, in the subtle rewiring of what power could look like. 2 months had passed since the last boardroom vote, since Richard had walked away from the office he once ruled, and in that time, much had changed. But not all of it came from the top. Cultural change, Desmond knew, didn't rely solely on leadership. It depended on what people chose to do once the spotlight dimmed. So when the handwritten letter arrived on his desk, addressed with quiet formality, Desmond paused before opening it. The envelope was ivory white, sealed in old-fashioned wax. Inside, Richard's handwriting was slow and steady, deliberate in tone, stripped of its usual bravado. He began not with apology, but with acknowledgement. "You were right. We got it wrong. I got it wrong. I see it now, and I'm trying to do something better with what I have left." The letter wasn't long, but it was sincere. Richard explained that he had started volunteering with a local nonprofit supporting mentorship for minority students. He had funded the creation of a small community initiative focused on professional readiness, soft skills, interview coaching, things he admitted he had once taken for granted. He asked for nothing. Not recognition, not redemption. Only understanding. The letter ended with a single line: "Maybe we don't fix the past, but we can build something better in its shadow." Desmond folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and said nothing to anyone. He didn't reply. Not yet. 2 weeks later, a junior associate stopped him in the hallway, breathless with excitement. A new career access center had opened on the east side. Small but well-staffed. Word was it had backing from some former industry heavyweights, and one of them had mentioned Desmond's name with respect. Desmond made a note to visit, not as an investor, not as a symbol, just as a man watching what his silence had seeded. The official invitation came days later, embossed and honest. The center had been named Threshold Initiative. Its mission, to prepare overlooked youth for industries that rarely look their way. At the bottom of the card, in careful print, was a quote from an unknown author. "You belong not because they let you in, but because you never needed their permission." The evening of the opening was overcast, but warm. A crowd gathered outside the small, brick building as music played low from portable speakers. Inside, walls were lined with donated suits, practice interview booths, career maps, mentorship sign-up lists. It was not glossy, it was not impressive, but it was real, and it was working. Desmond arrived without announcement. He didn't want to stand in front of cameras. He moved through the space quietly, stopping to talk to volunteers, shaking hands with students, answering questions about industries he knew far too well. At one table, he recognized Richard, not in a suit, but in a plain navy pullover and rolled-up sleeves, coaching a nervous 17-year-old through mock interview dialogue. Richard didn't notice him at first. When he did, their eyes met briefly across the room. There was no tension, only history. Richard nodded once. Desmond returned it. That was enough. Later, the organizers asked Desmond to say a few words. He declined at first, then agreed, but only if he could speak after the volunteers. When he finally stood in front of the room, he kept it short. He didn't talk about the boardroom. He didn't mention betrayal or victory. Instead, he told a story about the first time someone questioned whether he belonged in a place he'd worked hard to reach. He ended with a thought. This place you've built, it doesn't erase what came before. It honors it by refusing to repeat it. He left the stage to soft applause. Not thunder, but real. That night, walking back to his car, Desmond paused at a street corner near a school bus stop. A flyer for the center had been taped to the side of the shelter, its corners fluttering in the breeze. He smiled, then turned, watching the light turn green. On Monday morning, back at the firm, no ceremony waited. No new awards, just the sound of keyboards, the shuffle of shoes, the quiet rhythm of a workplace learning how to be better. Desmond stopped by the 12th floor cafe, as usual. Brooke waved from the other side of the room. Kyle nodded from his table. Even Chase, now returned from his sabbatical, passed him in the hallway with a measured, respectful greeting. Desmond entered the elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and waited. In the mirrored wall, his reflection stood tall, composed, ordinary. But behind his eyes was a truth he now lived by. Not that justice had been done, but that a better system had been planted. And one day, if watered enough, it would grow taller than the old one ever dared to be. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by hitting the like button and subscribing for more powerful narratives just like this one. What part of Desmond's journey hit you the hardest? Was there a moment that caught you by surprise? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. And while you're there, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this message is reaching.